Greetings. My name is Bishop Victor Phalana, the Bishop of Klerksdorp Diocese. I'd like to share with you some reflections on inculturation in the Southern African context. The 6th of January 1989 is a historical date in the history of the African Church. This is the day Pope John Paul announced a special assembly for Africa of the Synod of Bishops. The lineamenta, or the outline, focused on the necessity and meaning of evangelization. 5 different tasks of evangelization were identified. Number 1, proclamation of the good news. Number 2, inculturation. Number 3, dialogue. Number 4, justice and peace. And lastly, the mass media. The theme of the Synod was clarified. The theme was the Church in Africa and her evangelizing mission towards the year 2000. You shall be my witnesses. Acts 1, verse 8. The Church in Southern Africa took the challenge seriously, despite other pressing socio-political changes taking place at that time. South Africa was witnessing the birth of a new country, freed of the vestiges of apartheid and oppression. The Church was very much part of this transformation, and at the same time had to be part of the preparations for the convocation of an African Synod. The inter-regional meeting of the bishops of Southern Africa, called IMBISA, led reflections and workshops on the African Synod to the whole region. And I think this is one of the reasons why I became interested in the Synod and inculturation as well. The Synod was held in Rome from April 10 to May 8, 1994. The Synod concluded with the issuing of 67 propositions by the Synod Fathers and the endorsement of the propositions by Pope St. John Paul in the post-synodal apostolic exhortation called Ecclesia in Africa. This exhortation was issued in 1995, and in that same year, the Pope visited South Africa to present to the Southern African Church this post-synod exhortation. The African Synod is over, but I believe the work of the African Synod continues. And I present this paper as a contribution to the ongoing debate on the issue of inculturation. Many people want to understand what inculturation is. I was a member of the Committee for Culture in the Department of Liturgy of the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference. And as we went around for meetings and consultations, people were asking for clearer, simpler, and practical explanations of inculturation. And I hope to clear some misconceptions and misgivings about inculturation, since these wrong notions alienate and discourage people from being part of this process. I will propose areas we could focus on and also the challenges posed by this process. And let us start first with important definitions. What is culture? Culture in this instance refers to the human fashioning, working, and making an environment wherein and whereby people survive, live, and develop values and meaning in their lives. Culture is the whole way of life, material and non-material, of a human society. It is essentially social, the product of a society's tradition and its interaction with other societies. Culture is dynamic, not a static phenomenon. It is also a product of history. Culture is a pattern of shared assumptions expressed in symbols, myths, rituals that a group has invented, discovered, and developed. We can also say That culture is the way people express what is deepest and most important to them. For example, about family, sexual taboos, values, exercise of authority, and how to deal with illness, aging, and death. They do this in art, literature, oral tradition, and ritual. Culture includes the ethos of a people, the central story or vision that gives direction to their lives, the principles and governing concerns by which they gain a sense of order and cohesion in their lives. And we can also say that culture encompasses economic systems, political structures, and laws that give shape to a sense of right and wrong. Also included are the many ways in which human beings strive to express their perception of beauty in music, dance, architecture, and the fine arts. Wherever there are human beings, there is culture. Now, what is inculturation? Inculturation, in the context of the Catholic Church, is the dynamic relationship between the local church and the culture of its own people. Inculturation is all about the gospel we have embraced and the culture we live. Inculturation is meant to bring the power of the gospel into the very heart of culture and cultures. It focuses on two main issues. Number one, how to relate the Christian faith to the African cultural heritage. Number two, how to apply the gospel to the contemporary African political and socio-economic contents. Inculturation is a process whereby the gospel encounters and embraces culture where it is creative and fresh, because, as I said a bit earlier, inspired by Father Aylward Shorter in his book, Culture, An Introduction to Culture, an Overview. This encounter brings about something new, rich and beautiful for all humanity. The gospel purifies and transforms culture without destroying its values and beauty. The gospel welcomes and embraces every culture, but will also challenge what needs to be challenged. For example, Western consumerist capitalism is a culture of wealth and the glory of money. And of course, the gospel is going to speak to that culture and to say, is this value something to be upheld or something to be purified? In Africa, it is common, for example, to find blind veneration for one's tribe to the effect that one would marginalize other tribes. These things cannot be embraced, but must be challenged by the gospel of Jesus Christ. The encounter of the gospel and culture may be painful, but it is also an exciting experience. There is a lot of interacting, there is absorbing, there is rejecting, there is transforming, remembering old ways and inventing new ways. Culture is at its best when it is most creative. The Christian faith and the African culture are the beneficiaries of this encounter. On the one hand, what is authentically African is deepened and extended, and what is Christian is expanded. Inculturation has to do with the language people speak, their worldview, how they express themselves, the customs and belief systems, and how these systems influence their views. It is basically an attempt to reformulate our basic Christian faith through the mediation of African culture. The process of inculturation continues to inspire Christians in Africa to refashion and transform their culture so that their culture can be life-giving and life-affirming. Inculturation has a task of restoring African personality, dignity, and self-confidence. Inculturation calls for a spirit of creativity and imagination. There is a call to experiment and to take risks. We can anticipate moments, of course, of conflict, as it has happened in the past in the South African context. Anger, uncertainty, and error. But this anticipation and all these past experiences should not lead us to fear and despair. We must trust the Holy Spirit and the wisdom of the Church to guide us in this delicate process. Inculturation calls for openness and honesty. There must be a willingness to learn, even from our own mistakes. We must take initiatives. We must talk and be open to receive constructive criticism. Of course, some people who stand maybe for culture become very, very sensitive to criticism. But I think this is going to delay the process if we become overly sensitive. We must debate and see where we agree and where we differ. The process of inculturation has official approval and support. Now, let me touch basically the aims of inculturation to find out what the aims of inculturation are. Number one, inculturation is meant to ensure the authenticity and depth of faith in the African Christian. And this is the spirit and the sense of Pope St. John Paul. It is also meant to heal cultural alienation, to bridge the gap between life and faith, and thus resolve the instances of spiritual schizophrenia, if we can call it that, seen sometimes or manifesting itself in some of our Christian communities. People who believe in this but live another type of life. On Sunday they do this, during the week they do this, during the day they do this, at night they do this. That is spiritual schizophrenia. And this happens as a result of a faith that has not become part of people's lives and of their culture. We want to be African and do cultural things secretly while we do Christian things separately. So I think inculturation is intended to heal that. Number two, inculturation means affirming the cultural identity of the African Christian as an adult, full member of the worldwide Catholic Church, to whose richness and beautiful cultural diversity she too must contribute. It's a very important point. Number three, another aim of inculturation, we hope that through this process we will recover, rediscover, and salvage lost or disappearing spiritual values that are so important, enabling them to survive, grow, and be elevated, but also allowing them to be purified and transformed in the spirit of the gospel. Inculturation aims at encouraging conversion, the giving up of imperfections and errors which affect all cultures. I would like to look now at theological foundations, and I will rely very much on Ecclesia in Africa to assist us on that. Inculturation is related to the kenosis and incarnation mysteries of Jesus Christ. Kenosis refers to the self-abasement that the second person of the Trinity underwent in the incarnation, as we find it in Philippians 2:5-11 and the second book of Corinthians chapter 8 verse 9. This did not and could not mean abandoning the divine nature or substance. Rather, it entails accepting limitations of a human existence that in fact ended with the utter humiliation of death by crucifixion. This mystery of pouring himself out, taking the form of a servant, is a lesson for inculturation. It means that Christianity has to go through a kenosis experience to assimilate itself in the cultural riches of the local people and be enriched by different cultures. But also, our cultures need the kenosis experience to enable them to be enriched, challenged, purified, and transformed by the message of Christ. The post-synodal exhortation, Ecclesia in Africa, says, Just as the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, John 1:14, so too the good news, the word of Jesus Christ proclaimed to the nations, must take root in the life situation of the hearers of the word. Inculturation is precisely this insertion of the gospel message into cultures. The incarnation of the Son of God, precisely because it was complete and concrete, was also an incarnation in a particular culture. Just as the Word of God became like us in everything but sin, so too the inculturation of the good news takes on all authentic human values, purifying them from sin and restoring them their full meaning. You will find that in Ecclesia in Africa, number 60. And then the exhortation helps us to develop the theological basis of inculturation, looking also at another mystery. And in Ecclesia in Africa, number 61, we read, "Indeed, the incarnation of the Word is not an isolated moment, but tends to what they call Jesus' hour and the Paschal mystery. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit." John 12:24. This emptying of self, this kenosis, necessary for exaltation, which is the way of Christ and of each of his disciples, according to Philippians 2:6-9, sheds light on the encounter of cultures with Christ and his gospel. Every culture needs to be transformed by gospel values in the light of the Paschal mystery, according to Ecclesia in Africa, number 61. Let us also develop the theology of inculturation, according to Ecclesia in Africa, number 61. Inculturation also has a profound link with the mystery of Pentecost, found in Acts chapter 2. Thanks to the outpouring and action of the Spirit, who draws gifts and talents into unity, all the people of the earth, when they enter the church, live a new Pentecost. They profess in their own tongue the one faith in Jesus, and proclaim the marvels that the Lord has done for them. And this is important then as our theological basis. We can go on because we could cite many other scriptures there to give us the basis, but I think these two will suffice. Now, what is the criteria for inculturation? I would like to identify two. There could be more. Number one, inculturation is okay, but there must be compatibility with the Christian message. What is meant is that Africans are free to appropriate and interpret the Christian message, but cannot contradict the fundamental values of the Christian message as found in the gospel of Jesus Christ. This criterion does not negate the message of Pope Paul VI at Kampala in 1968, who said, "You may and you must have an African Christianity." It is a call for the church to present the truthful image of Christ in a local cultural phase. In this process, the same message of salvation is proclaimed in many tongues and languages, but it is the same message of salvation, not a different message. It is the task of the church in Africa then to reflect on what they believe is the center or the essence of the Christian message. There is also another important criteria: communion with the universal church. This process calls for the emergence of a local, you may call it an indigenous church, while remaining fully within the Catholic communion. Inculturation is not meant to lead to a breakaway from the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. According to this criterion, changes must take place within the family of the Catholic Church, the church of all nations and in all continents, and in communion with the success of Peter. It is a call for loyal collaboration and constructive criticism. We are not starting a process of founding a new church or a new religion. Inculturation is approved and encouraged by those 70 million Catholics in Africa, but they must also respect the relationship between the church in Africa and the Church of Rome. Those are the two important criteria as far as I'm concerned. I would like to identify 3 stages in the process of evangelization. The first stage, the missionary endeavor of the inculturation process, is ultimately the emergence of the local church. This is a moment when the church is no longer the object of evangelization, but becomes the subject of evangelization. The evangelization process includes the following stages. Number 1, we have the translation stage. This is an important stage and a necessary starting point in evangelization. It is unfortunate that perhaps during this process, some people focus on the literal translation of texts only. They focus only on colors, symbols, and liturgical vestments, which can be changed to reflect the local culture. But while doing that, we must take seriously people's worldview and values. So translations are okay. Changing colors, changing vestments, changing vessels are good, but they are not the be-all and the end-all of inculturation. In the translation stage, the entire catechism, the prayers, liturgy, and the Bible are simply translated into the new language with which no creative adaptation or modification or in accord with local custom or thought patterns is made. And this perhaps is the weakness. But it is an important step. We must not underestimate it, because it is through this step of evangelization that we have today many texts in local languages. So we must appreciate this step. But we could go perhaps into the second step, which I call the adaptation stage. During this stage, and it was the view of Vatican II, Sacrosanctum Concilium, that inculturation has, or evangelization has to also include this stage. During this stage, the Christian faith acquires certain elements of the host culture, which in turn adopts certain elements of the Christian faith and way of life. So there is a lot of borrowing. Such borrowing of concepts, symbols, myths, rituals, and structures may bring about an enrichment of the Christian faith on one hand, and the enrichment of the culture in question. Vatican II Constitution of Sacred Liturgy speaks of adaptation as the basic principle in all liturgical reform, if you read Sacrosanctum Concilium number 37 to 40. Yet adaptation has more recently been criticized as inadequate. In fact, some have even called it a subtle form of imposition and accused it of not truly taking the local culture seriously. Instead of getting inside, critics say that it remains outside or above. It is only willing to make or allow extrinsic, accidental, superficial changes in ways of being Christian. And so it is an important part of inculturation, but we must know that we can do a little bit more than that. Maybe also to take this time to talk a little bit about acculturation, which is what happens during adaptation. Acculturation is used in anthropological circles to denote the contact between cultures and the ensuing changes. Acculturation takes place when Christianity encounters a new culture. There is also enculturation. Enculturation, on the other hand, refers to the cultural learning process of the individual, the process by which an individual is inserted into his or her culture, while the process obviously includes formal teaching and learning. It is very largely an informal and even an unconscious experience of an individual learning culture through a process of adoptive learning whose rules are set by society. Now, we can look at the third stage. It's a very important stage in this process, what we call the inculturation stage. This is the stage of the emergence of local church. Stuart Bate says, we consider the concept of local church to be essentially correlated to that of inculturation. The local church is seen as the manifestation of church in a place. Looking at Vatican II Ad Gentes number 20 and Lumen Gentium number 26. The church is deemed to be fully present when local church exists in a place. The local church is a church incarnate in the people, embracing their humanity and experience, their fears and aspirations. It is a church free from racism and monoculturalism. It is native, springing out of the local culture, speaking local languages, dressed in local clothing, making the message of salvation and theology accessible to the people in their own language and according to their cultural patterns. It is a church rooted in the life of the people, to some extent conformed to that culture, enjoying a certain stability and permanence, having its own priests, religious and laity, with its own institutions and ministries, under the leadership of its own bishop, also involved in civil and apostolic action in the state. It is a church which has fostered its own theological, psychological, and human studies, a church where members feel at home. And for that, it is good to read Ad Gentes number 19 and also Redemptoris Missio number 48 and number 49. I was quoting a little bit earlier on Stuart Bate in his book Inculturation and Healing, from that last publications 1995, page 235. I would like now to address the levels of inculturation. We were dealing now with stages of evangelization. Now we are looking at levels of inculturation. The first level is what we can call the level of symbols and forms. It is an important level because here symbols are natural signs which yield an additional conventional meaning by being placed in a given existential context. We can talk here of African vestments, colors, vessels, architecture, artifacts, gestures, signs, dance, and musical instruments. They come within this level of inculturation. It is an important level. And it is important that we see at least some of our communities and churches moving when it comes to this level, doing something, being creative when it comes to this level. Unfortunately, it should not end here, because if we end here, we will now just remain on the superficial side of inculturation. Direct symbols are those symbols whose material image express what they mean ideologically. Indirect symbols are those symbols whose material image signify a different thing which is not immediately observable in the material. So we have to go to another level of inculturation, which is attaching meaning to these symbols. So on the second level, all symbols are organized and meaning is attached to them. The deeper level of inculturation is revealed when the church works hard to discover the meaning of certain symbols or to attach new meaning to old symbols. We are mainly responsible for attaching meaning to the symbols we identify with. It is one role of the church to discover the usage, purpose, and meaning of those forms and symbols. Some symbols are associated with certain values in a particular culture, and we must work hard to understand them. We cannot change symbols or displace them without proper understanding and clear cultural perceptions. In Rome, during the early years of Christianity, the church embraced, for example, the imperial culture, absorbing its symbols of authority, terminology, institutions, and festive celebrations, and Christianized them, evangelized them, purified them, so that they could be in harmony with the message of salvation of our Lord Jesus Christ. Symbols like altars, incense, vestments, and processions were given new meaning and were Christianized. In this way, the church could bring the gospel home to the people of Rome, to the people of Greece, or wherever the church was spreading, using their own local symbols, using their customs, using their languages. The third level of inculturation is what we call the level of fundamental values and ideas. This is what I call the deepest level of inculturation. This is the level of fundamental ideas, values, the worldview, and psychology of a particular people. On this level, the church needs to come to terms with the core of culture. The worldview tries to answer questions such as, who am I? Why do I exist? What is reality? What is the meaning of death, for example? What is the origin of the world? Why do things change? So we describe the first level as the level of symbols. Since culture is dynamic, symbols change, but fundamental ideas of a particular people linger on for ages. Symbols signify certain fundamental ideas, values, and goals of a particular culture. Louis Lusbetak gives the following dimensions of worldviews. He says there is cognitive dimension of the worldview. The worldview tells the society what and how it is to think about life and the world. In fact, it shapes the cognitive process as such. He also talks about the emotional dimension of worldviews. A worldview also tells the society how it is to feel about, evaluate, and react to the world and all reality. In other words, certain values, interests, and attitudes are so basic to the culture that they trigger deep emotional reactions throughout most, if not all, of culture. There is also the motivational dimension of worldviews. Motivational aspects of a worldview are a society's basic priorities, purposes, concerns, ideals, desires, hopes, longings, goals, and drives corresponding to its understanding of the universe. I just wanted to share that with you to show how important worldviews are. I was quoting Louis Lusbetak, The Church and Cultures, New Perspectives in Missiological Anthropology. It's a Maryknoll Publications, 1988. You can check page 253 to 255 for that. Thank you very much.